You always did like attention, my mother once said, flipping through one of my military awards. I guess the army just gave you better costumes. My name is Evelyn Rowe. I spent 23 years in uniform, led missions that most of these people couldn't stomach reading about. But here I was, just Evelyn, again the one who left. I carried that sentence with me longer than any dog tag. It wrapped around my spine like armour I never asked for. And now, standing at the edge of this room, full of small-town pride and smaller minds, I felt it echo again one last time before I walked into the fire. My boots clicked softly against the polished floor of the hawthorn room, Everstead's idea of elegance, all gold trim and candlelight, and enough pretense to choke someone. I hadn't been home in nearly 2 decades, but the smell of clove, ham, and rich people's perfume hit me like I'd never left. I paused at the entrance, straightened the lapels of my navy blue dress, and walked in alone. Every head turned. Then, just as quickly, they turned away. I scanned the room. Monica stood at the centre of it all in crimson heels, and a laugh rehearsed for the crowd. My mother sat beside her, cheeks taut from too much effort, her hands folded like a sermon was about to begin. My father gave me a nod, the kind that said, "Don't make this difficult." It was the same look he gave me at 13, when I'd come home with a busted lip and refused to explain it. "Oh, look, who decided to show up?" Monica said, raising her wine glass with a smirk that glittered like the chandeliers. Her voice carried just far enough. A few guests chuckled. Her husband Chase whispered something about honourably discharged from basic kindness. I said nothing. I didn't flinch. I walked toward the table. There was no seat waiting for me, not even a coat draped over one to signal someone cared enough to save a place. Just one chair remained at the far end next to the swinging kitchen doors. I sat down alone, the scent of dish soap and burnt garlic brushing past me every time the doors flapped open. Nobody asked how I'd been. Nobody asked who the little girl beside me was. Lena, 9 years old, sat tall in her simple white dress, her thick curls tied back neatly. She held my hand under the table. "Are we early?" she asked, her voice small. "No," I whispered, squeezing gently. "We're just different." A cousin across the table leaned toward his date and muttered, "Didn't know Evelyn had a kid." Or a husband. His date laughed. I didn't know Evelyn had feelings. More laughter. I sipped my water. Lena looked at me confused. "Why are they laughing?" I smiled at her lips tight. "Because sometimes people laugh when they don't understand courage." The seat beside me scraped loudly. My great-aunt Beverly settled in beside me, adjusting her pearls. She peered at Lena. "Your niece?" "My daughter," I said evenly. Beverly raised her brows, gave a tight smile. "Oh, that's modern. That's life," I said. Lena looked down, tugging at the edge of the tablecloth. I leaned closer and whispered, "You don't need to fold yourself smaller to fit their frame." She nodded bravely. Someone clinked a fork against a glass. My mother stood. Her voice rang clear and proud as she praised Monica's non-profit, celebrated my cousin's med school acceptance, and toasted a 5-year-old's spelling bee win. She didn't mention the daughter who once led combat rescue missions through night fire zones, didn't mention the medals or the valor cross I received with my ribs broken and boots blood-stained. I lifted my glass anyway. My father raised his toward Monica and said, "To the one who stayed." The whole table followed. My name wasn't spoken once. "You really thought this would be a good idea?" Monica leaned down beside me, her voice sugar-wrapped acid. "Showing up here with your accessory," she motioned toward Lena with her wine glass. Mum didn't want the vibe to feel overshadowed. You in your little military cosplay, and that she didn't finish. I turned to her, didn't speak, just stared. This was the same girl who once cried when I left for basic training and then never wrote. The one who wore my boots as a joke to a Halloween party while I was sleeping in foxholes. She smiled wider. "What is it?" Nothing to say, I smiled back colder. Not everything deserves a reply. She flinched just a flicker and walked away. Lena leaned into my side. Why does she talk like that? Because some people build their house on sand and hate the ones who learn to survive storms. Dessert was served. I picked at mine, appetite gone. A few people passed by, greeted Monica like royalty. Nobody noticed me. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. And just when the room had returned to its dull hum of cutlery and curated small talk, a voice cut through the air, clear, firm, unmistakably military. "Ma'am," it said. I turned. A young officer in full-dress uniform stood at attention beside our table. He looked past Monica, past my mother, directly at me. "Major General Rowe," he said. "Welcome home." Silence fell like a curtain. Monica froze. A fork dropped. Somewhere near the kitchen doors, a busboy stopped mid-step. "Private Harper." I nodded. He snapped a crisp salute. "And, hello, Private Button," he added, eyes twinkling at Lena. Her face lit up. "Uncle Jay," she whispered, standing. The officer bent, slightly touching her shoulder. "Good to see you again, soldier." And in that moment, the entire room learned what the military already knew. This wasn't shame I'd brought back. It was legacy. But that silence didn't follow us home. That night, in the cheap motel off Route 8, Lena curled up next to me, whispering, "I liked the part when he called me soldier." I kissed her hair. "That's because you are one." She fell asleep fast, her breath steady, peaceful. I stared at the ceiling. My rib twinged a scar that never fully healed. Somewhere inside that ache lived a memory I never wanted to revisit, but it stirred anyway. Kandahar 2011. The kind of mission that doesn't make it into newsreels or bedtime stories. 2 convoys down, ambushed in a valley that felt like the end of the world. Radio silence broken only by screams, and the static that sounds too much like breathing when you're trying not to die. I crawled through blood-soaked sand and bullet-whistled air to reach a sergeant bleeding out from his femoral artery. "I ruined your boots," he gasped. "They're standard issue," I told him. "You're not." He laughed, choked, apologized again. I held his hand until it stopped shaking. Then I stood up, wrist fractured, vision swimming, still gave the next order, because no one else could. That night, when the medevac finally took off, I didn't cry. Not when mortar fire nearly collapsed our tent. Not when they zipped up 3 of my men into body bags with the same quiet efficiency they used for supply crates. But that boy's hand that stayed. Months later, in a hospital bed with wires in my chest and morphine in my veins, I got a single card. Not from my parents, not from my sister, from a private in Bravo Company. "You held the line for us. We saw you." That was it. 5 words. But they did more than any medal. No one from home called. Not even when I made the paper. General Rowe leads civilian rescue in fire zone. The article used a photo of someone else. No one noticed. I signed my discharge papers with my left hand alone. That was the day I stopped expecting applause. Then, Lena happened. It was the tail end of monsoon season in Djibouti. We were rotating back from an op, half the unit still covered in mud, half in mosquito bites, when we found her on the steps of the barracks. Faded blue blanket, no note, no sound, just a pair of brown eyes wide and unblinking, like she'd already lived through too much to bother crying. I was the ranking officer. Protocol said call local authorities. But I looked down and she looked up, and I swear something passed between us that outranked everything I knew. I picked her up. "You're safe?" I said. She blinked once. That was it. No paperwork, no questions. She was mine, not by blood, by decision. The platoon became her village. The mess cook warmed milk for her before he made coffee for the rest of us. Vega, the same guy who could break down a rifle in under 9 seconds, learned how to braid her hair. She learned to walk in boots, 2 sizes too big, wore camo like it was second skin, and knew every soldier's name by heart. But she only ever called one person Ma, and that was me. When she had nightmares, she crawled into my cot. When she had her first fever, I sat up 3 nights with her while a sandstorm rattled the windows. No one from my family ever knew. Not because I was hiding her, because they never called. Not once. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask if I had someone. They saw a line on a military bulletin once Rowe commended for humanitarian action and forwarded it like a coupon they didn't intend to use. Lena didn't know her birthday, so we picked one together the day she was found. Every year I baked her a cake out of MRE packets and heat tabs. One year, Sergeant Miles carved her name into an old Kevlar helmet. Private Button's first combat crown, he called it. She wore it to bed for a week, and when command visited, she stood at attention, saluted and shouted, "Sir, yes, sir," louder than half my company. They didn't know whether to laugh or salute back. No one dared suggest she didn't belong. Not there. Not in that world where loyalty meant more than lineage. But back here in this town, they squint like they're trying to find the resemblance. I don't explain. I don't owe them that. I remember one morning during our first week in Everstead, watching her look out the motel window, legs swinging above the carpet. "Do all mums wear uniforms?" she asked. "No," I said, "but the good ones show up for duty." She smiled. "Then, you're the goodest one." I'd earned rank in hell. But that was the first time I felt like I'd won something sacred. The next morning she brushed her teeth humming cadence songs. I looked in the mirror and realised no matter how small the chair they gave me at that table, I had built something far bigger outside it. Lena didn't need their blessing, and neither did I. She was already learning what it meant to carry your name with pride, even when no one clapped. The day after the dinner, we stopped by the town bakery for something sweet. Lena chose the cookie shaped like a star, blue icing, gold sprinkles. The cashier, middle-aged, tight-lipped, looked at me, then at her, and said, "Yours?" I nodded. "Adopted?" she asked as if it mattered. "Mine," I said simply. On the sidewalk, Lena squeezed my hand. Did I do something wrong? I crouched to meet her eyes. Never. People just have small windows for big stories. That afternoon, back in the motel, I opened the deployment trunk I hadn't touched in years. The latches creaked. Inside were medals, folded flags, and at the very bottom a worn folder, edges curled from heat and time. I hesitated before pulling it out. The letter was still there. My handwriting, my truth wrapped in silence. I wrote it in a field hospital, ribs, taped lungs, raw hands trembling. The night before, Captain Miles Bennett had made a call that saved 37 civilians, including 11 children from a planned airstrike. Intelligence was bad. They'd been labelled insurgent affiliates, but Miles wasn't convinced. He disobeyed direct orders, rerouted our convoy mid-mission, and evacuated the village himself on foot through sniper fire with a busted comms line and nothing but gut instinct. It was the right call, but it wasn't clean. Command was furious. The Pentagon had prepped a press release about a successful precision strike, not a rogue captain going off script. Someone has to be held accountable, the colonel had said. His eyes never met mine. I was the ranking officer. They wanted a name, so I gave them mine. The letter was 3 pages. I remember every word. To whom it may concern, it began. The decision to alter the mission path on 12th of July 2011 was mine, made under my full capacity as acting commander of Bravo Unit. Captain Bennett followed my direct orders. He exercised restraint, courage, and clarity under fire. Any deviation from command protocol was under my instruction, and I assumed full responsibility for its outcome. I ended with, "If consequences are to be assigned, let them fall where they belong." I stand by this decision. I stand by my men. I didn't name the children. I didn't describe the way one of them clung to Miles's flak jacket like it was life itself. I didn't mention that 2 hours after the rescue he was shot dragging the last evacuee to the truck, that he bled out in my lap while whispering, "Make it worth it." A week later, he was gone. And the letter, the one no one ever saw, was buried with the rest of our ghosts. I ran my fingers across the ink. The words were still steady after all these years, but I wasn't sure I was. Lena looked up from her colouring book. "Is that another medal?" "No," I said, something harder to carry. I slipped the folder back under the fatigue shirts and old maps. That night my father called. First time in months. I answered on speaker. Lena sat beside me. "You're not making this easy," he said, parading around with a child, no explanation. "People are talking." "Let them," I said. "They think she's, what, a souvenir?" His voice was half laugh, half accusation. Lena's shoulders tightened. "She's my daughter, no husband, no wedding." "You think that plays well here?" I looked at Lena. She met my eyes with quiet strength. "I'm not interested in playing well," I said. He sighed. "We just want what's best for you." "No," I said. "You want what's easier to explain." I ended the call. Lena didn't cry. She didn't speak. Just reached for my hand and rested her head on my shoulder. Minutes passed like that. Then softly she said, "You don't talk when they say mean things." I looked at her. "Do you want me to?" "No," she said. No, you're not ashamed." "I'm not," I whispered. "Not of you. Not of anything I've done." "Good," she nodded resolute. "Because you stand like a hero." That night, I dreamed of Miles, of that mission, of the crack in his voice when he'd said, "They'll come for you, not me." I had promised him I could carry it. I hadn't expected to carry it alone this long, but maybe now I didn't have to. After Lena had fallen asleep, one hand curled around the stuffed army bear Sergeant Vega gave her on her 5th birthday, I sat at the edge of the bed and listened to the hum of the wall heater. I thought about what it meant to protect someone, not with words or medals or polished statements, but with silence. With weight you agree to carry so someone else doesn't have to. That's what I'd done for Miles. It wasn't a favour, it was a vow, the kind you never speak aloud. I remembered the day I handed that letter to command. The general didn't thank me. He just filed it away like an inconvenience. Miles didn't get a full honours funeral. Too complicated, too messy for headlines. But I lit a candle in every base I served at after that. Quiet ones, just for him. And now I carried Lena too. I wondered if she'd ever ask how she ended up at that base. If one day I'd have to tell her someone left her behind, and if that would break something inside her I'd spent years trying to build. But for now, she was whole, and I was enough. The next day, we walked through downtown Everstead. The stairs were sharper, whispers followed us like shadows. That's her, no ring on her finger. You know what they say. I kept walking. Lena squeezed my hand. They think we're weird, she said. I smiled. Better weird than weak. We passed a group of teenagers outside the cafe, one of them nudging the other. Her mum's a general or so, she says. Probably just a washed-up soldier. Another voice added, Bet that kid's not even hers. Looks nothing like her. I stopped, turned, just slightly looked them in the eye. Not with anger, with steadiness. Courage doesn't always look how you expect it to. Then I walked on. Didn't break stride. Lena beamed. That was like a movie, she said. It was real, I told her. That's even better. Later in the motel, she drew a picture of us two stick figures, holding hands, one with a big star on her chest. That's you, she said proudly. The brave one. You're brave too, I said. But I don't have a star. She frowned. You don't need one. Yours is already inside. That night, I reread the letter. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before: a faint fingerprint. Smudge maybe from Miles, maybe from me. It didn't matter. What mattered was this: I hadn't written it out of guilt. I wrote it because I believed in something bigger than rules, bigger than myself. Miles had taught me that. And maybe in a different way, so had Lena. I folded the letter, placed it in the bottom of Lena's backpack between her storybook and the MRE cookie she liked saving for emergencies. Not because she needed to carry it, but because one day she'd need to know where truth begins. It doesn't start with applause. It starts with choosing who you'll protect when no one's watching. And I'd chosen. The bell above the bookstore door still jingled like it had a decade ago. I hadn't planned on stopping by, but something in me, it wasn't nostalgia, not quite needed to know if the place still smelled like ink and dust and a little bit of regret. It did. Lena stayed outside with a juice and a sketch pad, humming a cadence song to herself, boots swinging off the edge of the truck bed. Just a minute, I told her. Okay, she'd replied, but if it smells boring, I'm drawing dragons instead. Inside, nothing had changed. Same sagging bookshelves, same handwritten category signs taped to the ends. And tucked behind the counter, my father's back slightly hunched shirt, tucked into belted slacks like he was afraid of coming undone. Didn't think I'd see you here, he said without turning. Didn't think you wanted to. He glanced at me over his shoulder. Not untrue. I said nothing. Walked past him toward the back office. The door creaked the same way it always had. Light filtered in through the blinds, slanting over the desk and shelves like lines drawn in a war map. On the wall, among faded photos and generic certificates, one frame caught my eye. It bore my name, sort of. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Rowe. Underneath, recipient of commendation for overseas humanitarian service. No mention of rank. No mention of the Valor Cross. Not even the right unit name. The photo beside it was cropped so tight you couldn't see the ribbons. Just my face, half-shadowed, and the faint curve of a smile I didn't remember making. Next to it was Monica's non-profit award blown up like a campaign poster. Glitter, foil font, centre stage. I ran a finger along the edge of the glass. She said it was cleaner. My father's voice broke the silence. What was your story? I turned. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. All that combat, the blood, the violence. It's not what people around here like to think about when they see the word hero. Isabel, she's easier for the narrative because she never risked her life, because she never questioned the story, he replied. And you questioned everything. I questioned lies, I said. He sighed. We needed cohesion. Donors media, no one wants to hear about your wounds, Evelyn. They want symbols they can polish. I looked back at the frame. You altered official commendations. It was for the fundraiser. They wanted all the children represented. Isabel's work with the shelter, Monica's outreach. Not all the children buried friends, I said, or carried civilians under fire. His mouth tightened. You think anyone wants to hear about that at a church gala? They want smiles. Evelyn, pretty ones, not broken women with battlefield stories. I stepped forward, lifted the frame from the wall. It wasn't heavy, just hollow, like every justification he'd ever given. I opened my coat, slid the paper inside, folded it, creased it down the centre until it stopped pretending to be proud. That's not theft, he asked. No, I said. That's reclamation. There was a long silence. Then he spoke again, voice softer. You know what scares me? Not what you did, but that I didn't ask. I let them change your name on paper like that would soften your past. And you let it happen. No, I said. I let you happen. He looked like I'd slapped him. Then, slowly, he walked to a drawer and pulled out a small folder. They wanted me to sign off on a photo for the mayor's wall, your deployment ceremony. I didn't, but I kept this. He handed it to me. Inside was a print-me-bloodied but upright flag patch, torn, cradling a child in my arms amid rubble. My helmet hung loose eyes scanning the horizon. "You looked like someone worth trusting," he said, "even if I didn't know how." I slid the photo behind the altered certificate. "If you ever want to tell the full story," I said, "start with that one." I walked out before he could answer. Outside, Lena was sketching a dragon in front of a bookstore. "It's breathing fire," she said proudly. "Into the sky, not at anyone. Why not at someone I asked? Because sometimes you just want to be seen," she said. I ruffled her curls. "Let's go." As we drove away, I didn't look back. Some buildings don't deserve second glances, and some legacies don't belong in frames, they belong in the hands of the ones who lived them. As I tucked the folded frame into my coat, a wind chime outside caught a sudden breeze, its sound thin and brittle like laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. I turned once more to scan the back office. The same cracked mug sat on the desk, world's okayest dad still visible beneath a coffee ring. A bitter smile flickered across my lips. I remembered the first time I'd stood in this office with scraped knees and a perfect spelling test, hoping he'd look up from his ledger and say something, anything. He hadn't. "You know," he said quietly behind me, "when you were little, you used to arrange the books by colour. Took you hours, customers hated it. But you let me. I let you because it was quiet. You didn't ask for much." "No," I replied. "I learned early not to." He exhaled a soft sound like something collapsing. "You were always the brave one." I turned to face him fully now. "Then why didn't you say that?" Ever he looked away. It scared me. What you became, the risks, the danger. I didn't know how to be proud without being afraid. I let that sit in the air heavy and unfixable. "That's not how pride works," I said finally. "You feel it anyway. Or you don't." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. Outside, Lena held up her dragon sketch. "It's got medals now," she said, "because it's a hero." I looked at the wings she'd drawn wide and fierce. "You gave it stars." "Uh-huh," she nodded. "It earned them." I buckled her into the truck and climbed in. For a long time, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there watching the bookstore through the windshield, its painted sign faded to the colour of memory. "What's wrong?" Lena asked softly. "Nothing," I said. "Just wondering how long it takes a place to notice it's missing something important." She leaned her head against the seat. "Maybe it never notices, but that doesn't mean you put it back." I looked at her, really looked. Her hand still smudged with crayon, her eyes too wise for 9. "You're smarter than I was at your age." "Maybe," she said, "but you were stronger." Am I corrected gently? "I'm still here," she smiled. Then, "Let's go, be here somewhere better." I turned the key. The engine started, and we left that bookstore behind like a chapter that had nothing left to teach. But in Everstead, the past doesn't stay shelved, especially not when it can be curated for charity. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at her motel. Heavy stock embossed seal, no return address. Inside an invitation, the Isabel Rowe Foundation annual gala. A fundraiser. A photo of Isabel in a velvet gown with the tagline celebrating women of grace. Below it, in smaller print, family encouraged to attend. Family. That word again, always shaped like a welcome, always used like a weapon. Lena read it before I could tuck it away. "Is she the one with the shiny shoes?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Are we going?" I paused. The answer should have been no. But then, Lena whispered, "It says family," and for her sake I couldn't pretend the word had lost all meaning. The country club wore wealth like costume jewellery, obvious overdone and slightly tarnished. Valets avoided eye contact. The host scanned the list and offered a clipped smile. General Rowe and... guest. Daughter, I corrected. She handed us the seating card without apology. Table 17, near the restrooms, between swinging doors and strategic obscurity. Lena squeezed my hand. This table smells like lemon cleaner. That's how they scrub out discomfort, I muttered. We sat. From our vantage point, we could see the back of the stage and the backs of heads. Centre, spotlight Isabel, in silver chiffon, backlit like a beatified martyr. The screen behind her played a highlight reel, rescued women, smiling interns' ribbon cuttings. Not one mention of Kabul, or Kandahar, or me. Then the MC polished and saccharine stepped up. Isabel Rowe is more than a philanthropist. She's the embodiment of grace reborn from family shadows. Applause. She's turned a complicated name into a crown of courage. Another round of clapping. Lena leaned in. That's a lot of talking for not saying anything. That's politics, I said. You bury truth under polish. Then, dessert came a dollop of lemon foam and a raspberry. I excused myself, old instincts rising. I didn't look like a threat in a cocktail dress. But I was one. Behind the stage, velvet curtains hung like secrets. I moved, silently, breath measured. Then, voices. Heard she brought the kid. Let her. It makes her look unhinged, like she's chasing relevance. A scoff. You think she'll speak? A pause. If she does, we have the letter. Kandahar, her signature's on it. My blood iced. The letter. Miles's letter. My letter. One leak to the right outlet, and she's not a hero. She's an unhinged officer who disobeyed chain of command. We frame it right, she's a liability, not legacy. Something heavy pressed into my chest. My hands were shaking, but not with fear. With fury. I stepped back into shadow, leaned against a utility closet, trying to slow my breath. It wasn't the letter that threatened me. It was their version of it. Back at the table, Lena had drawn a new picture, a ballroom swallowed by a dragon's flame. That's you, she said. You're the fire. I'm the wings. I almost laughed, almost cried. Good. Stay close. We fly soon. We didn't stay for the closing speech. On the way out, a young assistant offered a glossy gift bag. I looked inside lipstick, a donation form, and a card that read, "Thank you for supporting women who rise." I left it on the nearest table. We had already risen, without their permission. Outside, the night was cool, the stars unbothered by the pretenses inside. Are we in trouble? Lena asked. No, I said. But they might be. Why? She tilted her head. Because they forgot the most dangerous person in any war, I looked down at her, smiled, is the one who knows how the story really ends. And behind us, somewhere inside that golden cage, a curtain stirred. And a carefully constructed legacy took its first invisible crack. 2 days later, Lena and I walked downtown past the post office and the bakery with the crooked welcome mat toward a shopfront I hadn't noticed before. The windows gleamed with curated reverence, gold trim, soft lighting, and a sign etched in cursive script, the Isabel Rowe Center for Women's Empowerment. Lena tugged at my sleeve. Look, she said, pointing at the glass. That's your medal. I froze. There, framed behind the spotless pane, was a replica of the Silver Valor Cross, my Silver Valor Cross. Except it wasn't labelled mine. The placard beneath read, "In honour of heroic service abroad." Donated by the Rowe family to inspire future leaders. No name, no unit, no truth. Just a hollow symbol neatly staged for photo ops and board meetings. I stared at it for a long moment. Is that yours? Lena asked softly. It was, I said. But now it had been repurposed, scrubbed of blood, and story polished into palatability. Next to the medal was a looping video, Isabel shaking hands with senators, smiling at ribbon cuttings, holding toddlers in disaster zones she'd never set foot in. A voiceover narrated in syrupy tones. At the heart of courage lies compassion, and no one exemplifies this more than Isabel Rowe. My stomach turned. She hadn't just borrowed my bloodline, she'd borrowed my battlefield. I stepped closer to the glass. My reflection merged with the medal. For a second, it looked like I was wearing it again. But it didn't feel like honor. It felt like erasure. "Can we go inside?" Lena asked. I hesitated, then nodded. A receptionist greeted us with the forced warmth of someone trained to scan for donations. Not dignity. The lobby smelled like new paint and lavender. We wandered through the exhibit hall, a curated maze of plaques, portraits, and soft lighting. In one corner stood a mannequin, dressed in a generic military uniform, no name tag, no insignia. Just enough to suggest valor, not enough to verify it. A group of teenagers snapped selfies beside it. "She was a general, right?" one of them asked. Maybe another shrugged, or like someone's sister who was. I kept walking. Lena stayed close. Then, tucked between a wall of donor acknowledgements and a timeline of family milestones, I found it, Isabel's gala photo blown up like a campaign poster. In it, she wore a navy sash and a brooch unmistakably modelled after the Miles Bennett memorial pin, the one only given to those involved in Operation Silent Rain. The operation we never spoke about, because it had cost us too much. "That's not hers," I whispered. My voice felt foreign in the sterile space. A staffer glanced over. I stepped back. Lena looked up. "Are we leaving?" "No," I said. "We're learning." That night back at the motel, I opened my trunk again. At the bottom, beneath Lena's drawings and the folded flag from Miles's service, was the real pin. Mine, the only one that mattered. I held it in my palm, cool, heavy, real. Then I noticed something odd. Its back was looser than I remembered. I pried gently. Inside the hollowed backing, a tiny memory card. My heart caught. Miles. It had to be. I slotted it into my old field laptop. The screen flickered, then opened a single folder. Audio Zo 1. I pressed play. Static. Then his voice. "Rowe, if you're hearing this, I guess I didn't make it. But listen, what happened in Kilo Sector wasn't clean. They moved weapons through that corridor using civilian routes. That's why I rerouted. I had to. I logged everything, coordinates, contacts, radio chatter. It's all here. And if Command tries to bury it, don't let them. Tell the truth. Tell them I died trying to protect the people we were meant to serve." I closed the laptop. The silence after his voice felt cavernous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you've been carrying the map the whole time. I looked at Lena. She was asleep, curled up with the dragon plush Sergeant Vega had mailed her last Christmas. She looked peaceful, unaware. But that peace, her peace, had come at a cost, and the receipt was buried in my hand. I held the pin tighter. Isabel hadn't just used my name. She'd stepped onto a stage built on someone else's death. That was theft. This was war, and I knew how to fight one. The next morning, before the sun had lifted the weight of night off the town, I laid out everything on the motel bed, like I was prepping for a mission. The letter, the pin, the laptop. Miles's voice still echoed in my skull, measured, resigned, too calm for a man moments from death. His final words weren't for glory. They were for justice, and they'd landed in the one place someone might actually do something about them. I stared at the medal again, its hollow back now cracked open like a secret finally tired of hiding. The micro SD card was no bigger than my thumbnail, but it held the truth of a war no one wanted remembered, especially not the Rowes of Everstead. I clicked open the folder again. There were logs, audio, coordinates, even time-stamped reports of cargo manifests marked non-lethal aid, but the serial numbers matched Russian arms smuggled through villages we'd sworn to protect. Miles had uncovered it, had tried to stop it, and Command had let him die quietly to keep it quiet. I opened the second audio file. "Rowe," he said again, his voice weaker this time, Don't let them build statues on our bones. Not if they're made of lies. I closed the lid. My hand hovered over the power button, then pulled back. This wasn't just evidence, it was a reckoning, and reckoning has to be timed right. Lena stirred under the blanket, eyes fluttering open. Did we win something? She mumbled, glancing at the medals. Not yet, I said, but we're getting close. At noon, I drove us to the old armoury. Not the official one, the retired building near the edge of town that had been turned into a historical museum no one visited. It still had a utility room in the back, and inside that utility room was my old field locker. I'd left it there when they shuttered the place, unsure if I'd ever come back. The key was still tucked in the doorframe, taped behind a rusted screw. Inside my second set of fatigues, wrapped in a thermal blanket, a thumb drive, unmarked. And at the bottom, a canvas bag labelled simply, for Evelyn. I'd almost forgotten Miles left it for me the day before the mission. I opened it now. Inside was a handwritten log in his angular, impatient handwriting. If I don't make it back, someone has to know why I ran toward the gunfire. Spoiler, it wasn't bravery. He had listed names, places, a hand-drawn map with red X's marking villages used as cover for arms trafficking. It matched the audio. It confirmed everything. The Rowe legacy wasn't the only lie curated for public comfort. Command had orchestrated far worse. I leaned against the locker, breathing slow. This wasn't just Isabel's fraud anymore. This was federal and dangerous. But silence was no longer an option. Miles had died with dirt under his nails and a child in his arms. That deserved more than a foundation gala. That deserved history corrected. I scanned the room for a place to scan the thumb drive. An old desktop still blinked green near the front exhibit. I booted it up, downloaded the files, then printed copies, every log, every photo, every transmission. The machine groaned under the weight of truth. When it was done, I slid everything into a manila folder and labelled it with a single word, witness. That evening, I mailed a copy to a friend in DC, a veteran-turned-whistleblower lawyer. Then, I locked the originals in a fireproof bag. Lena watched me carefully, her drawing pad balanced on her knees. "Are you scared?" she asked. I paused. "No," I said. "I'm angry." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Can we still draw dragons?" "Always," I said. But maybe now they breathe truth instead of fire. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat beside Lena and stared at the ceiling, remembering Miles's last breath. Remembering how we'd carried his body out under moonlight, pretending the silence was holy, not shameful. I owed him more than memory. I owed him clarity. And I knew where to start. Isabel had borrowed my medals, my narrative, even my grief. But I had something she didn't proof. And a plan. Tomorrow, I'd let her legacy meet the truth it tried to outrun. The National Veterans Honor Conference didn't usually get media coverage. It wasn't glamorous, no red carpets, just stories, grit, a lot of scar tissue. Which is why I chose it. Not for the optics, but for the weight. The room was full of people who didn't need their courage explained to them. They'd earned it, and they knew what it meant to be forgotten. I arrived in civilian clothes. No dress blues, no medals, just a simple navy coat and Lena by my side, her hand small and solid in mine. The auditorium lights buzzed faintly overhead as we entered. A few heads turned, a few eyes widened, but no one said anything yet. I took the stage after a former Marine shared a poem about the men he left in Fallujah. My name wasn't listed on the programme. I hadn't submitted a topic. I just walked up, took the mic, and said, "I'm not here to tell a war story. I'm here to end a lie." Then I stepped aside. The screen behind me lit up with footage, grainy, time-stamped. A map, a convoy route, redacted lines slowly reappearing. Audio crackled and then his voice. "Miles. Rowe." If you're hearing this, I guess I didn't make it. But listen, what happened in Kilo Sector wasn't clean. They moved weapons through that corridor using civilian routes. That's why I rerouted. I had to. I logged everything, coordinates, contacts, radio chatter. It's all here. And if Command tries to bury it, don't let them. Tell the truth. Tell them I died trying to protect the people we were meant to serve. The room was silent. No coughs, no movement, just breath held sharp, reverent. Then the voice cut again, a final line from a different clip. Tell Rowe. She'll know what to do. The lights came up slowly. I stepped back to the mic, but didn't speak. Instead, a man in a suit walked forward, DOJ badge clipped to his coat. He held up a folder. What you've just witnessed, he said, is part of an ongoing federal investigation into the mishandling of civilian safety protocols during Operation Silent Rain. Major General Evelyn Rowe is a federally protected whistleblower and material witness. She came forward at great personal risk. We stand behind her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then, something I didn't expect. Applause. Not polite, not performative. Real, heavy, rising, veterans, civilians, gold, star mothers, people who knew what truth cost. They stood, one by one, not for spectacle, but for solidarity. And in that moment, I didn't feel exposed. I felt seen. Lena looked up at me, eyes wide. Are they clapping for us? Yes, I whispered, for us, for Miles, for everyone who never got a chance to speak. A woman approached the stage, grey bun service pins across her blazer. She didn't smile. She just placed a hand on my arm and said, My brother was in Kilo. They told us it was a clean op. Now I know why I never believed them. I nodded. My throat burned. Backstage, my lawyer pressed a document into my hand. Your protections are solid. Command is rattled. They'll come after you with everything they've got. I know I said, let them. As we stepped outside, cameras flashed. I offered one line to the reporters. This isn't about tarnishing legacies. It's about telling the ones we buried too soon. That night, Lena and I didn't go back to the motel. We drove north to a cabin owned by a friend from my last deployment. No cell signal, no expectations, just silence and firewood. Lena curled up beside the hearth dragon plushie in her arms. That was scary, she whispered, but we did it. We did, I said, brushing a curl from her face. And now the hard part's theirs. I opened the laptop again just once more, played Miles's message in the quiet, let the words wash over me not as orders, but as absolution. We hadn't won, not yet, but the tide had turned, and this time I wasn't the only one watching the water rise. My parents called 2 days after the exposé went live, first time in months. Their invitation was tentative, wrapped in old etiquette. Would you consider coming home for dinner? I said yes. We arrived at the house mid-afternoon, light filtering through lace curtains like cautious hope. Mum's hand shook as she set out dishes, pot roast mashed potatoes, green beans. She avoided my eyes until I sat. Finally, she drew a breath and said, Evelyn, I started telling people you were gone. It was easier to think you dead than to fear you never would come back. Her voice cracked. Every time there was no letter, no word, I convinced myself it was just safer to imagine you gone. My heart tightened. Some part of me ached for her fear, the fear she never admitted. I reached out her hand, cold in mine. No forgiveness, just understanding. Dad sat stoically at the head of the table, folding and refolding a napkin. When he looked at me, there were no judgments left, only raw acknowledgement. He stood, cleared his throat. Those commendations you found, they were never yours to sanitize, he said. He held up the fake certificate. I'm sorry I let others rewrite your record for comfort. He set the frame face down without shattering the glass. Then he pulled out the black and white photo she'd given me in the bookstore. This one, he said, voice thick. This is the one we should have shown. You stood in fire and held a girl like she mattered. And until now, until all of this, I didn't know how to be proud and terrified at the same time. There was a long beat of silence, a universe recalibrating itself in our living room. Then, Dad did something I'd never seen. He stood and tore the altered commendation into jagged strips. They fluttered like wounded birds to the floor. "It's gone," he said. "So are the lies." Mum covered her face with her hands, tears falling into the folds of her apron. We were silent, she whispered. We didn't speak because we didn't know how to say the truth. And that made us complicit. I swallowed. "You didn't do it to hurt me," I said. "You did it to protect yourselves from what you couldn't understand." She nodded, head bowed. "I wish I'd tried." He crouched down, meeting my eyes. "You stood like a hero, Evelyn. You carried what none of us could imagine. And for that, I'm proud." A quiet erupted around us, no clamour, just the relief of honesty after a lifetime of half-truths. Lena giggled from the next room, finishing her drawing, a dragon breathing stars. Dad smiled at it. "That's the best medal I've ever seen." Lena scampered in and flung her arms around my legs. "Mommy's home," she declared to everyone. And in that moment, the house exhaled memories no longer whispered, but spoken, accepted, healed. Dinner ended with no speeches, no forced praise, just simple thanks. I looked at my parents, really saw them broken, mending, learning to speak the truths they'd long avoided. I realized healing didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came with a plate of food and a long overdue apology. That night, I tucked Lena into bed and thought about how easy it would have been to stay silent with my parents, with my grief, with the truth. But by doing this, by showing up, speaking up, I'd ask them to show up too. And they did. Tomorrow would bring court filings, testimonies, headlines. But tonight, in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by fractured memories and the ache of unspoken words, we started something real. The ones who stayed silent had finally spoken, and in doing so had given me the strength to stand even taller. But strength doesn't keep storms away. It only teaches you to face them. And mine arrived not with thunder, but with headlines. The news cycle erupted like a controlled burn gone rogue. Leaked files, emails, whispers turned into statements. Isabel's name dropped from podiums and press kits like a scandal no one wanted to claim. The General Rowe Foundation suspended operations pending internal review. Her face, once glowing in print, now blurred behind headlines False Valor Allegations Foundation, tied to military misrepresentation when legacy is a lie. And yet I felt no victory. Just a quiet shift in the air, like the town finally exhaled something it didn't realise it had been holding. I didn't gloat. I took Lena to the library. We borrowed picture books and an atlas. I made soup and taught her how to iron patches onto her backpack. Outside, the world churned, but inside we stitched our days together, like soldiers mending torn flags, one thread of peace at a time. And then Isabel came, not with cameras, not with perfume and perfect phrasing. She came to the motel door in a grey coat, too thin for November, her hair unbrushed, her eyes unpainted. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded. "Barely." Lena glanced up from her drawing and quietly slipped into the next room. Isabel stood just inside the doorway, clutching a manila envelope like it might hold her last defence. "I didn't come to spin anything," she said. "I know I can't undo it, but you should know I wasn't the one who started it." I raised an eyebrow. She exhaled. "It was Dad's idea. After you left, he said we needed someone the town could rally around. Mum said you were too complicated, too much blood, too many medals. I let them shrink you, and I wore what they cut from you like a borrowed crown." She offered the envelope. "These are internal emails, communications with the donor board, edits to your commendations, notes on how to make me more palatable." Her voice cracked. "I used to think it was strategy. Now I know it was cowardice. I didn't take the envelope, not yet. I just wanted to be enough, she whispered. For them, for this place, for the story. I looked at her, not with anger, but with something worse clarity. You were always enough, just not for their idea of perfection. And neither was I. But you didn't have to step on my back to climb into their version of love. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. What do I do now? Tell the truth, I said. Not to save yourself, but to honour what it cost the rest of us. She nodded. I can't fix it. No, I said, but you can stop pretending it wasn't broken. She left the envelope on the nightstand, and as she turned to go, Lena peeked around the corner. Isabel knelt. You probably don't like me. Lena tilted her head. I don't know you, but I know she's strong, and you made her smaller. Isabel looked down, nodded. That's fair. Then Lena added, but people can grow again if they stop shrinking others. I watched Isabel walk away like someone stepping out of a costume that no longer fit. Later that night, I opened the envelope. Photos, drafts, PR memos, and at the bottom, a note in Isabel's handwriting. Just 5 words, I see you now. Finally, the next day, the town paper printed a retraction. Full page, my photo in uniform, not cropped, not shaded, captioned simply, Valor cannot be rewritten. Outside the coffee shop, someone stopped me. A man in his 50s, holding a to-go cup with shaking hands. You don't know me, he said, but my son, he didn't come back. And you made it feel like someone stood for him. Thank you. I didn't know what to say, so I just placed my hand over my heart. He nodded, walked on. Isabel's office windows were covered now. A Felice sign hung crookedly in the frost. The crown had burned, and in its ashes, maybe something honest could finally grow. That night, Lena curled beside me in bed, whispering, What happens now? I kissed her forehead. Now we rebuild. With truth this time. And as she drifted off, I stared at the ceiling, imagining miles, somewhere far beyond it, smiling. Not because we'd won, but because we'd stopped pretending we hadn't lost something first. 2 weeks later, I stood before the skeletal frame of what used to be the town's abandoned library. Annex, shingles half-ripped windows, sealed with plywood ivy choking the bricks like silence had tried to claim it. But in the light of a pale morning, something had shifted. It wasn't grand. Not yet. But it was honest. A sign nailed to the chain-link fence read in bold paint strokes, the Rowe Centre for Truth and Honour, opening spring. Below it, in Lena's uneven handwriting, someone had scrawled in bright marker, where brave stories live. She hadn't asked, just wrote it, and I hadn't erased it. The building wasn't much, just bones and dust. But bones, if tended right, become the spine of something that stands. I walked inside boots, kicking up memories with every step. I could still hear Miles' his voice like gravel and gravity saying, Don't let them build statues on our bones. I hadn't. I was building something better. A space where no one needed permission to be remembered. Lena ran through the gutted main room, arms out like wings. Can we have a wall of medals? She asked. Not the shiny kind, she added quickly. The real kind. With stories. I smiled. Every medal here will have a name, and every name will have a voice. She nodded solemnly like she understood. Because she did. The town council hadn't approved the centre easily. But the documents Isabel left, the emails, the memos, the buried truths had done more than exonerate me. They'd ignited something. Accountability, grudging respect, and under all that, a spark of collective reckoning. Even the mayor, red-faced and hesitant, had said, maybe it's time we stop curating and start confronting. It wasn't a victory, but it was a crack in the wall. Veterans started writing in, from states I'd never set foot in. Their stories, unpolished and powerful, came scrawled on notepads typed on old computers, sometimes dictated over tearful calls. I didn't edit them, I just collected. Framed. Honoured. Lena sorted them by theme: bravery, sacrifice, what they left behind. We argued over, colour-coding, laughed when the labels got smeared with glue. She called it organising the truth. One morning, I received a parcel with no return address. Inside, a folded flag, a bronze star, and a note that simply read, "He never got to tell it. Maybe you can." It didn't say who. It didn't have to. The centre was already doing what I'd hoped, becoming a place for the unfinished. The forgotten, the too complicated for garless kind of truth. Lena asked if we could name the front room. The courage room, I offered. She shook her head. The Miles room, she said, because without him, we wouldn't be here. I nodded throat tight. We hung his photo beneath the quote he never got to say at a podium. Protect what matters even when it costs you everything. Volunteers came, strangers mostly. A retired nurse who'd patched up soldiers in Fallujah. A trans veteran discharged before repeal. A widowed mother whose son never made it past training. They painted walls, sanded floors, and told stories while they worked. Each tale added brick to memory. We didn't sanitize. We didn't polish. And slowly, Everstead, this town that once recoiled from complicated courage, began to walk through our doors. School groups came. Church groups. Even my mother, once tentative and brittle, stood beside a display and whispered, "He was in your unit," I nodded. "One of the best?" She looked at the picture for a long time, then placed her hand gently on the glass. "Thank you for remembering him." And Isabel. She never asked for a plaque, but she donated all her foundation's assets quietly, anonymously, to fund the centre's scholarship wing. One day, Lena found her scrubbing the tile grout in the bathroom with a toothbrush. "Aren't you rich?" she asked. Isabel smiled faintly. "Rich doesn't fix what I broke, but maybe work can help me start." At night, Lena and I sat beneath the newly hung sign and watched the wind move through the flag we'd raised. "Does it feel better now?" she asked. "It feels honest," I said, "and that's more than I ever hoped." She leaned against me. "Then, maybe this is what winning feels like." I didn't answer. I just closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, to the wind, to the echo of stories no longer buried. We hadn't erased the pain, but we'd given it a name. And sometimes that's the first step in healing. The next morning, I opened the window, just as the sun broke over the trees, soft light pouring in like forgiveness. Lena was still asleep, her breath even one arm draped over the dragon plush. Outside, the world moved slowly, unaware or maybe uninterested that a war had been fought and a truth finally spoken. But I knew, and so did Miles. I whispered his name once just to feel how it sounded, without guilt wrapped around it. It didn't echo. It stayed, quiet, present. The documents were already in the hands of the DOJ, the Pentagon, and 3 investigative journalists. By now, they'd all heard Miles's voice. By now, the lies were cracking like old paint. But part of me knew not all of them would pay. Some men vanish behind polished silence and emeritus titles. Some legacies won't burn unless you light the match yourself. That evening, I received a letter, handwritten. No return address, just a wax seal pressed in crimson. Inside, a single page. "He saved my son," it read. I never knew his name until now. "Thank you for giving him back to us." No signature. Just a pressed flower taped at the bottom, a violet, a soldier's burial flower. I folded it carefully and placed it next to the Miles Bennett memorial pin. That night, Lena asked, "Do you think Uncle Miles is watching?" I nodded. Always. She looked at the stars. Then I hope he saw you tell the truth. I think he was waiting. I brushed her hair back. Maybe he was, maybe they all were. Weeks passed, headlines flickered, congressional inquiries launched. Isabel's foundation issued a clarification, retracted 2 awards, and announced a leave of absence citing mental health. Not an apology, but a crack. And cracks let light in. I didn't return to Everstead. Not fully. The bookstore was sold. The empowerment centre shut down for restructuring. Dad mailed me the altered commendation still torn. I figured you'd want the ashes, he wrote, to know it really burned. I didn't reply. But I kept the envelope. Proof that something finally ended. One quiet morning, Lena brought me a picture. It showed 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing at the edge of a cliff. The sky above them wasn't blue. It was filled with names. "What is it?" I asked. She said, "It's us. And behind us, the ones who couldn't say anything. But we carry them now, right?" My throat tightened. "Yes, we do." I pinned Miles's letter, now laminated inside Lena's storybook. One day, when she asks more, I'll show her the full folder. But not yet. Right now, she's still drawing dragons, still humming cadence songs, still choosing courage without knowing the price. And that innocence, that unbroken trust, that's what I fought for. Not medals, not praise, not vengeance. One evening, we visited a small veterans cemetery off Route 6. No marble, just simple headstones, crooked and sun-worn. I found Miles's. No flowers, no visitors, just silence. I placed a folded flag at the base. "You weren't forgotten," I whispered. "You were just waiting." Lena stood beside me. "Does he know you kept your promise?" I looked at her. "Yes, and one day you'll keep mine." She didn't ask what that meant. She just took my hand. Back home, I wrote one final letter. Addressed to command. Short, unflinching. "You erased him. I wrote him back in. You buried the truth. I built a monument out of it. And if you ever try to rewrite that story again, know this: some of us aren't afraid to burn it all down just to light the way." I never mailed it. I didn't have to. Truth doesn't need a stamp. It needs a witness. And I was no longer the only one. Some stories don't end, they echo. Through letters, through daughters, through whispered names at grave sites no one else visits. We don't always get justice, but we get voice. And sometimes that's enough to lift the dead and the living in the same breath. If this story found you, if you've ever been silenced, buried, or rewritten, know this: you are not alone. And your voice still matters. Drop your stories in the comments for the ones who never got to finish theirs.